And welcome to the Great Deception Podcast. I'm your host, Matt. Thanks for joining me. We made it, guys. We made it through the crazy season, but now winter is coming. So, with that said, make sure we're taking care of ourselves, staying away from the sugars as much as possible, right? That Halloween candy is always laying around. We got Thanksgiving around the corner. We got all those delicious pies, and then Christmas. And guys, we wonder why we get sick, right? Just a little pointer there, because it's one thing I'm gonna try and be cognizant of this winter. See if it makes a difference. Can't hurt, right? So we got some fun stuff coming up. I hope you guys liked the previous episode we did on the old world architecture with Matthew Smith. I've been getting great feedback on that. And we are going to run that back and do another one. I think next week we'll have that out. So I'm going to be talking with him later this week. We got some good stuff coming. I love discussions like that, and we have discussions like that in the Patreon, and that's where I came across Matthew and a couple other good folks in that group. So if you do want to join the Patreon for as little as $3 a month, it's patreon.com/The Great Deception Podcast. It'll get you in all the videos that I post out there, all the Monday Night Master Debaters, get you in the calls and all that stuff, and they're a lot of fun. We got a nice little group of people here that are contributing, and together we're having a lot of fun and uncovering some stuff. Nothing major. We're not going to break the historic barrier here, but we're putting little chinks in their armor. And so working with Matthew is a lot of fun. He's got a lot of great knowledge, and as by the numbers show, you guys are enjoying it as well. I just mentioned Patreon. We got 2 new patrons this month, guys, or this week, I should say. I got Casey. Thank you, brother. I appreciate it. And what's that? I don't want to misgender you, what's that, but I greatly appreciate your contribution. Thank you very much. And I look forward to talking to you here. So if we think about it, it's worth it. Get out there, get on the Patreon. The other thing I wanted to do here was share some reviews. Okay. So 5-star review. Show intro is dope. Both shows. L. Nelson Bay. I appreciate that, brother. Thank you very much. I do take pride in my intros. That is one thing that I do really work hard on. So my friend Elle, she said, you reinvigorated my love of history. I've always been a history buff, but realized that libraries were mostly full of fiction books, and my love of books diminished because the history I was reading was fairy tales. Thanks to Matt, my view of history has changed and encouraged me to take a more investigative approach, because the truth is out there. You just have to dig and go to primary sources. I love that he also does solo shows on conspiracy and historical topics, as well as Monday Night Masturbators with guests. It's like having 2 podcasts in one feed. Miss L, thank you very much, and I appreciate the kind words. And yes, that's why we have the Monday Night Master Debaters, is just for that purpose, so that we can do our thing, right? We can have our serious little one-on-one discussions that I like to have with you all and myself. And these are the things that go on in my head and what I'm looking into. And then the Monday nights is just a free-for-all, and we get to meet cool new people, get some differing opinions, have some great discussions. We had a great discussion on the last night's Master Debaters with Operation Red Pill guys. Go check that one out. A lot of fun. Those guys are great. Make sure you go check out their show. I feel like I'm going to be a broken record with these guys, because every week I'm learning something new. I'm laughing while I'm doing it. It's the best of both worlds. So Operation Red Pill Podcast, go check it out. They're working on the Trivium they just put out, and the Quadrivium's coming out this week. So Guys, if you're looking to learn stuff and be entertained, go check out Operation Red Pill podcast, and you will hear my Monday Night Master Debaters that's coming out, or will be out by the time this is out. Another one that I just listened to that blew my mind was Macroaggressions with Charlie Robinson. It's number 281. He just did it with Josh Sigurdson, who's one of my favorite like independent guys. He just goes around investigating old sites. He's been out into the middle of the Sahara, where he believes Atlantis came from. Just a really, really fascinating guy, and further promotes the idea that the narrative that we've been given is corrupt, and that it's our job, if we want to prove it wrong, to get out there and do stuff, not just sit on your ass and complain and post memes. Do stuff, research, get your hands dirty, go out to sites. I know traveling's not the easiest for everybody, but everybody can get on the internet. You can go dig through archives, you can find source materials, and that's what it's going to take. So go check out that Macroaggressions. Again, it's number 281 with Josh Sigurdson. Great episode. Highly recommend it. So with that said, let's get to tonight's fun. Tonight is the culmination of the 1871 fires. This is mainly the Peshtigo side, the Wisconsin side of the fires. And what we're looking at here, for those that are watching it, is this is the U.S. Weather Bureau map prepared from reports made by the U.S. Army Signal Service observers at 5:35 p.m. Central Standard Time, October 8th, which is the night of the fires, 1871. And it shows the course of cyclonic storm that prevailed on the day of both the Chicago and Peshtigo fires. And guys, if you look at this cyclonic storm, this is not normal. It's centered, it's like on the border of Colorado. Yeah, I mean, it's dead in the Midwest here, but it stretches out into Canada, well into Canada. It goes down into Texas, all the way to the West Coast, to past, California, to the Pacific Ocean, up into Oregon, through Idaho, and it's just a massive. It covers more than 50% of the United States. What caused this? A cyclonic storm. So then we start getting into the fires, and you're wondering, okay, well, there's obviously this crazy pressure going on. We've already been told that there was a drought, so there is basically it's tinderbox, and all it takes is the igniter, and that's what we're trying to figure out. What was the ignition source? Okay, we're told in Chicago it was a cow knocking over a lantern, which, by the way, she has been pardoned. Mrs. O'Leary has been forgiven and not blamed for starting the Chicago fire. And to this day, it remains a mystery, because they never investigated it any further. We start looking at Peshtigo. What happened there? Same thing. And we're going to see that tonight. Tonight, I'm going to take you through the Great Fires of Chicago book again, but we're going to look at the Wisconsin side here. But I wanted to, one of my new Instagram buddies sent me this, and this is a book called Wisconsin Stories, The Peshtigo Fire by Reverend Peter Pernin. And that's what we're going to read tonight. Okay, that's part of one of the source documents that we're going to go through. And guys, I love the fact when people are sending me, pictures like this and saying, they're out there doing research, they're in old bookstores, they're in different places looking, they're on the ground in their towns. It's great. It's great to see. We're not apathetic. We're not going to be docile. We're not just going to fall for the machine. We're out there doing our part. Now, what I wanted to show you was, this is Peshtigo before the fire. Okay, pretty well populated. It's really hard to see because it's such a viewed out aerial view. But then we go to it 10 years after, And man, they developed it very, very well. And that's what you're going to see. You're going to see these fires after the areas burn. It's usually a certain area too. I mean, Peshtigo and Michigan are rarities. I mean, because we're talking millions of acres burned. It's usually like Chicago, where it's a targeted, focused fire in a certain section of the city that gets leveled, just totally leveled. These fires reach that temperatures that are just unimaginable at times. I mean, there has to be some sort of, and what I'm trying to figure out here and why I'm going this route is we're trying to figure out, we know the fires happened. We know the conditions based on that map we just showed. There were cyclones, there were heavy winds going on. There was something even called a firestorm. I don't know. I wasn't aware of that these were a real thing, but a firestorm is a conflagration which attains such intensity that it creates and sustains its own wind system. It is most commonly a natural phenomenon created during some of the largest brush fires and wildfires, although the term has been used to describe certain large fires. The phenomenon's determining characteristic is a fire with its own storm force winds from every point of the compass towards the storm's center, where the air is heated and then ascends. So it's like a mushroom cloud, right? Brush fire. And let me see here. Let's go back to that. We'll go back here. Where is it? Okay, so this is how a firestorm how a firestorm forms. So you have the air rushing in from all sides, the heat rises, and it gets that uplift. And that's one of the interesting things that you see in these firsthand accounts. You hear about the fire jumping. You hear about the fire rising above hilltops. And this is why. It's from these firestorm conditions. And what we see is just pure and utter devastation as we go through, right? I'll show you some pictures here, but look, guys, how is this coincidence? Right, that this entire area burned. We saw the winds and we know it was dry, but this is massive amounts of land across water. You know, it goes across Lake Michigan, across Lake Huron, north, south, east, west, all around fires. It's just amazing. And in the power of this, when you hear the descriptions, is just unbelievable. Like we heard in the Chicago ones, the people were running towards the fire at times. It was so discombobulating, disorienting that these folks lost their survival instincts. Which, think about the terror you must be in, or the panic that you must be in to get to those conditions. All right. And guys, there's tons of books out there on Peshtigo and the fires. So if you want to go check them out, go check those out. But we are going to get into the book because that's where it's at right now. So we have the fires in Michigan and Wisconsin. This is from the Great Fires of Chicago. We had the book in last time, and I will on the Patreon. This will be free on the Patreon feed. I will link the book if anybody wants to look for the book. I'll link the PDF out there. But this is the Michigan and Wisconsin fires. Okay, well, the fire fiend, I love how they call it the fire fiend. They're giving it personification. It was raging in Chicago on the day consecrated to rest, Sunday, October the 8th. It was also sipping full of horrors in several of the towns in Michigan and Wisconsin. The result was far greater loss of lives than occurred in Chicago. The number of men, women, and children burned to death and otherwise killed outright being estimated from 12 to 1,500. Remember, in Chicago, it was just, they said maybe 250, maybe 300. This is 5 times that. We believe no account places it below 1,000. Fires had been raging in the woods around town for some days, without creating the various apprehensions, great endeavors being made, however, to stay the flames. The extreme drought had paved the way for the pitiless fire fiend. Again, fire fiend. We have endeavored to secure as correct an account from the eyewitnesses, telegraphic dispatches, and papers as possible of the great fires in the north, which we have deemed proper should accompany the more complete recital of the Chicago horror. So this is from the Marinette and Menominee Eagle Extra. Marinette, Wisconsin, October 9th. The fires have been lurking in this vicinity for weeks, have last culminated in the Holocaust of destruction. There's that word again, guys. And what you see here, and that's an interesting point from this account, there were mentions in a lot of the accounts that there were fires periodically throughout the summer. And so they were battling fire constantly because of how dry things were, but nothing to the extent where they would describe it as a holocaust of destruction. Last night, the wind raised and blew fearfully from the south. The swamp lying back in Dr. Hall's became ignited, and the flames spread through the inconceivably rapidity. Okay, so you hear that? The swamp lit on fire. The fire was about 3/4 of a mile distant from Marinette and shooting above the tallest treetops, lit up and was holding high carnival, having selected the towns of Peshtigo, Marinette, and Manistee as its prey. Every available force could be brought to bear to stay the force of the fire was brought in requisition. Standing out on the Peshtigo Road, were a witness to an awful scene. The fire swept through the swamp and destroyed several outbuildings of the rear of Boone Company's place and Dr. Hall's altogether large barn containing nearly 100 tons of hay. I mean, think about that. The hay was the property of Mr. Bentley of Marinette. At this time, the direction of the wind changed rapidly, blowing several points of the compass alternately. First from the southwest, then from the west, then from the northwest, then back again to the south, during which time we were visited by a series of whirlwinds which showered cinders and sparks in every conceivable direction. The fire having partly spent its fury here, cries of distress were heard down the river in the direction of the mouth. Steam whistles of the mills and the tags in the harbor blew the first alarm, and every man that could be spared went to the scene of the disaster. From the rear of J.S. Hickey's store in the direction of the bay, all was broad, lurid sheet of flame as far as the eye could reach. At this time, no hopes was entertained of saving anything. Men worked with the energy of despair. Sickening rumors came up the scene of devastation of the fire fiend. Rumors that Manistee was destroyed. The Catholic Church, Union Schoolhouse, McCartney and Hamilton's mill, Bagley and Curry's sash, door and blind factory, a new and splendid building just completed in operation, and the whole lower part of Marinette were in flames. Just below Marinette Ironworks, the fire was raging so fearfully that it was impossible to go any further. It was evident that the rumors which we had heard were, alas, too true, with the exception that the buildings in the lower portion of Marinette were not yet in flames. The fire had burned clear up the fences, and here, by the hardest work, its progress stayed. The streets were lined with men, women, and children fleeing for their lives. Many of the families were engaged in making excavations in the sand and bury their household goods. Any quantity of goods handed over onto the island. The sick were being removed and to places of safety, and thus, alternate in hope and despair, the long, weary hours of the night wore away. So what you're just seeing devastation. Because it says here, Menacani destroyed. At daylight, we received more definite information from the scene of devastation at the mouth of the river. Everything from the particular value was destroyed. Spalding, Hoftelling and Johnson's Mill, valued at $80,000, known as the New York Mill, the Exchange House, Mills Company Store, the Boarding House, Dr. Sherman's Drugstore, okay, on and on and on. The luckless inhabitants are houseless and homeless. And that's what we see over and over again. And it says here, Peshtigo's wooden ware factory, valued at several $100,000. Their water sawmill, grist mill, machine shop, sash factory, stave and boarding house, warehouses, everything is gone. And that's what you see over and over again. So we get this, you get Mayor Ludington of Milwaukee. He publishes the following appeal for aid on October 14th. So it's almost a week after the fire. The calamities have befallen our state and some of our neighboring states is truly appalling. Over 1,500 men, women, and children have been burned to death in Wisconsin alone. Their business, houses, and farms, to large extent, entirely destroyed. The very soil having been burned and destroyed all their autumn root and crops. They are utterly destitute and will require full support at least another season. 7 counties in our own state and thus are in great part utterly desolated. Whole regions of the country in western Michigan are in the same condition, and these fires are still raging and destroying. So we're talking a week later and they're still burning. Milwaukee is doing all she can, as by her close neighborhood to Chicago, where she enabled to send large quantities of supply in that city during the progress of the fire, feeding her exhausted citizens. Vast number of Chicago sufferers are now filling our houses and public buildings, and we have ministered to their necessities. We have supplied hundreds of tons of provisions and clothing, stoves, and other useful articles to Chicago and northern Wisconsin and western Michigan. We are doing our best, but the amount of suffering in our state is beyond our power alone to assuage. We appeal for public aid. We will be dispensed of supplies in Wisconsin and dispensers of supplies in Wisconsin and western Michigan. We have made every kind of necessary arrangement to accomplish these purposes with economy and effect. All contributions in money may be sent to Alexander Mitchell, a banker. Trust your bankers. I'm sure there was no laundering during all this money exchange. All the contributions in clothing, bedding, and other necessary supplies may be directed toward Harrison Ludington, the mayor. Signed, the mayor himself. So we're going to look at Menominee. It has suffered some extent, how much we are unable to tell. It is conceded some of the mills and many of the dwellings were burned. The mill and the point where, we will try and give the public the particulars from all these points as soon as we can ascertain them. Some errors, both in expression and fact, may have crept into the foregoing, for we write this with our eyes nearly blinded from the smoke and flames last night. 4 children were burned up the river State Road on the Menominee side. McCartney has $8,000. We're not reading all this. This is just describing the destruction. Okay, so now I do want to look at Manistee because this is the following account from the burning of Manistee on October 11th. The fire which broke out in the Pinneries northeast of here last week was almost subdued when a heavy gale sprung up from the southward, driving the flames and cinders toward Guilford's and Ruddock's mills. The fire company checked, but on Sunday evening, fire broke out near Canfield's mill, which is situated at the mouth of the river, and so intense was the heat that the men could not get within 1,000 yards of it. In less than half an hour, the mill, together with about 20 dwelling houses and boarding houses, were totally consumed. A hill intervening between this and the town, the fire could run no further, and the people were already congratulating themselves upon the narrow escape of the Manistee when the bright light was noticed northeast from the scene. And repairing to the spot, we found a number of dwellings wrapped in flames and a regular equinoctial gale blowing. thus making it beyond human control to stay the conflagration. The damage at present is inestimable, but the largest part of the town, which is on the south side, is destroyed. While so far 27 buildings, they love their numbers, are totally gone on the north side. The losses, as near as I can learn, amounts to $1,300,000 with only about 1/5 insurance. And that's what you're going to see here. You're going to see insurance companies go belly up. And this is where building codes change. This is where everything starts to change because of insurance. And this is where the insurance companies start to take over. Several serious accidents occurred and some lives have been lost, but there's such tumult and excitement that no one can give a fair answer to a question. Where 6 mills stood yesterday, not a vestige remains, except bungled up machinery, the woodwork and logs having burned out entirely. Blackbird Island is no more. The distress is great, and if the flood does not come forthwith, there will be starvation. Nothing can be heard from the north and northeast villages, as the heat prevents communication. The roads are so dry that sawdust burns like powder. The Manistee is leaving, and I cannot give further particulars. All right, so we got this last account from Peshtigo. Direct accounts from Peshtigo inform us that the great number of lives lost there occurred thus. Fire had been raging around the village some days before, had become subdued, and people felt secure. When on Sunday night, all of a sudden, when the wind was blowing a tornado, it again broke out from the fires of the camps at hands at work on the railroad and immediately overwhelmed the village. Inmates of the houses only having time to escape as they arose from their beds. The village could not have contained more than 500 or 600 or 1,000 at most of residents, but it is estimated that 1,000 transient men were in the place, lumbermen mainly. The river runs directly through the village, and there was but one bridge. I think it's a typo. The 2 people that live on the main portion of the village were driven by the rushing flames directly towards the river, and, horrible to contemplate, cattle had preceded them and blockaded the passage to the bridge. Consequently, human beings had to take to the water, when a large portion were either burned to death or drowned. One man who escaped the reports that he sank his entire body in the water, occasionally raising his head to get breath, and that he saw several women perish right alongside him. When rescued, his eyes were completely blinded, but are now partially restored. He, as well as a boatload who escaped, came down to Green Bay on a steamer yesterday, while there was another boatload left behind awaiting the coming boat. Some 150 men find escape cut off, took to a large barn belonging to Peshtigo Company, and they were burnt up in it. A lady came through here, has her hair on one side of her face burnt to a crisp. She says there was no smoke from the buildings, but it was complete glare of glowing blaze, awful to behold. Not a vestige of anything wooden is left of the place. Those that came through the scattered throughout the state, wherever they have friends. The wounded have been moved to El Canto, mainly as being the nearest village, which is south of Peshtigo. The villages of Marinette and Menominee, 6 miles north, being themselves partly on fire, offered no chance for help or protection to the sufferers from the quarter. So what you just see is just pure and utter devastation, death, destruction. Now we are going to go to the account of Mr. Peter Pernin. And I'm not going to read the entire thing because I believe it's 27 pages. Yeah, 27 pages. So I'm going to pick around and give you some of his firsthand accounts of this devastation as he travels around the area. And, you know, again, I will also leave this link in the PDF on the Patreon. So if you want to go get it, it'll be on patreon.com/Great Deception Podcast. And the links will be down below. So this Reverend, and this account didn't surface for a couple years. So there was a lot of question around it at first as to, you know, who was this guy? And then all of a sudden, then it got published, and it was, you know, now it's out there in multiple sources. But it says, yeah, okay, yeah, we're going to go to his account. So this is Reverend Father Pernin in about 1874. Good looking dude. Looks like an honest guy. Doesn't look like a pedo. Let's hope not. All right. So we're going to get into this here where he says, the danger proved more imminent in places exposed to the wind, and I learned the following day on my return to Peshtigo that the town had been in great peril at the very time that I had lost myself in the woods. The wind had risen, and fanning the flames had driven them in the direction of the houses. Hogsheads of water were placed at intervals around the town, ready for any emergency. I will now mention another incident that happened a few days before the great catastrophe. Okay, and this is when he was driving home. His second parish, situated on the river Menominee, about 2 leagues distant. Oh no, we're not reading this. He's trying to get to his other parish, but let's get to this one because this is much more interesting. It said, it may thus have been warnings were not wanting. He didn't want to hear it, right? I give them now another trait, more striking than either of those just related, copied from a journal published at Green Bay. It is a description of combat sustained against terrible element of fire at Peshtigo, Sunday, September 24th, just 2 weeks before the destruction of the village. Okay, so this is 2 weeks before. As I said before, there were fires around the area throughout the summer. So Saturday, the flames burned through to the river a little above the town. And on Saturday night, much danger was apprehended from the sparks and cinders that blew from the river into the upper part of the town near the factory. It burned the tops of the tallest trees, enveloped them in a mantle of flames, or winding itself up them like a huge serpent, crept from to their summits out upon the branches and wound its huge folds about them. Hissing and glaring, it lapped out its myriad fiery tongues, while its fierce breath swept off the green leaves and roared through the forest like a tempest. Ever and anon, some tall old pine, whose huge trunk had become a column of fire, fell with a thundering crash, filling the air with an ascending cloud of sparks and cinders, whilst above this sheet of flames a dense black cloud of resinous smoke, in its strong contrast to the light beneath, seemed to threaten the death and destruction to all below. Thousands of birds, driven from their roosts, flew about as if uncertain which way to go, and made the night still more hideous by their startled cries. Frequently they would fly hither and thither, calling loudly for their mates, then, hovering for a moment in the air, suddenly dart downward, disappear into the fiery furnace beneath. Thus the night wore away, while all earnestly hoped, and many hearts fervently prayed for rain. So you're seeing even the animals are messed up by this. They're all discombobulated, disoriented. And that's what they say. One of the first signs of like a natural disaster is that the animals start behaving oddly, because there must be some frequency or some vibration that they pick up on, and they know something's about to go down. So it says here, Sunday morning, the fires had died down, so that we began to hope the danger was over. At about 11 o'clock, while the different congregations were assembled in their respective churches, the steam whistle on the factory blew wind blew a wild blast of alarm. In a moment, the temples were emptied into their worshippers, the latter rushing wildly out to see what happened. Fire had caught in the sawdust near the factory again, but before we reached the spot, it was extinguished. The wind had suddenly risen and was blowing a gale from the northwest. The fires in the timber were burning more fiercely than ever and were approaching the river directly opposite the factory. The air was literally filled with burning coals and cinders, which fell, setting fire all around. And the utmost diligence was necessary to prevent these flames from spreading. The engine was brought out, and hundreds of pails from the factory were manned. In short, everything that was possible was done to prevent the fire from entering the town. He said, but now the danger arose. The fires from the west of the town were approaching rapidly, and it seemed nothing short of a miracle could save it from utter destruction. A cloud of hot, blinding smoke blew in our faces, and it was extremely difficult to see or do anything. Still prompt, energetic means were taken to check the approaching flames. Okay, so it goes Monday. The winds veered to the south and cleared away the smoke. Strange to say that not a building was burned and the town was saved. Monday, the factory was closed to give the men rest. And today, September 27th, all is quiet and going as usual. He said the company caused all combustible materials on which a fire could possibly be feed to be taken away and augmented the number of water hogsheads girdling the town. So now they're starting to make preparations, right, for a fire if something were to happen. So he goes on to say, God willed that I should be at the post of danger. The steamboat which I had expected to bear me from Peshtigo on the 7th of October had, of course, obeyed the elements which prevented her from landing. But God is the master of these elements, and him they obey. Thus I found myself at Peshtigo Sunday evening, October 8th, where, according to all previous calculations, projects, and arrangements, I should not have been. So this is where he's saying his boat didn't show up. It's like all those people that went to work on 9/11 and they didn't get the call, or the people that didn't happen to miss their flights on that morning. He wasn't as lucky. His boat never showed up, so he was in Peshtigo. He goes, in the order of the world, everything contributed to keep alive these two different impressions. On the one side, the thick smoke darkening the sky, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere, the mysterious silence filling the air, so often presage of storm, seemed to afford grounds for fear in case of a sudden gale. On the other hand, the passing and repassing in the street of countless young people bent only on amusement, laughing, singing, and perfectly indifferent to the menacing aspect of the nature was sufficient to make me think that I alone was a prey to anxiety and render me ashamed of manifesting the feeling. So he's like, why am I panicking? It's like, look at these kids over here. Now, ignorance is bliss, right? Is what the saying is. And I think that may be where we are right here. I think they are just out, out in la la land, hoping, just ignoring it, and it will go away. So let's get into some of the accounts. I stepped over first to the house of an elderly, kind-hearted widow, a Mrs. Dress, and we walked out together on her land. The wind was beginning to rise, blowing in a short fitful of gusts, as if to try its strength, and then as quickly subsiding. My companion was as troubled as myself, and kept pressing her children to take some precautionary measures, but they refused, laughing lightly at her fears. So they're like, yeah, you're ridiculous. It seems like the kids in this instance were just impervious to this. They did not care at all, which is kind of interesting. At one time, whilst we were still in the fields, the wind rose suddenly in more strength than it had yet displayed, and I perceived some old trunks of trees blaze out through without seeing about them any tokens of cinder or spark, just as if the wind had been a breath of fire capable of kindling them into a flame by its mere contact. Okay, so let's go over that again. He perceived some old trunks of trees blaze out through. Oh, blaze out, though, without seeing them any tokens of cinder or spark. We extinguished these, the winds fell again, and nature resumed her moody and mysterious silence. I re-entered the house, but only to leave it, feeling restless, though at the same time devoid of anything like energy, and retraced my steps to my own abode to conceal within it, as I best could, my vague but continually deepening anxieties. On looking towards the west, whence the wind had persistently blown for hours past, I perceived, above the dense cloud of smoke overhanging the earth, a vivid red reflection of immense extent, and then suddenly struck on my ear, strangely audible in the preternatural silence reigning around, a distant roaring, yet muffled sound, announcing the elements were in commotion somewhere. I rapidly resolved to return home and prepare, without further hesitation, for whatever events were impending. From listless and undecided as I had previously been, I suddenly became active and determined. This change of mind was great relief. The vague factors that had been heretofore pursued me vanished, and another idea, certainly not a result of anything like a mental reasoning on my part, took possession of my mind. It was not to lose much time in saving my effects, but to direct my flight as speedily as possible in the direction of the river. Smart, right? If you want to survive, who gives a shit about your things, your belongings? I mean, other than some clothes and maybe a blanket or something, some socks. Worrying about possessions at this time is going to be a death sentence. He goes, it was now about 8:30 in the evening. I first thought on my horse and turned him free into the street, deeming that in any case, he would have more of a chance to escape thus than tied up in the stable. I then set about digging a trench 6 feet wide and 6 or 7 feet deep in the sandy soil of the garden. And though the earth was easily enough to work, my task proved a tedious one. The atmosphere was heavy and oppressive, strangely affecting the strength and rendering respiration painful and laborious. So he's feeling it. The fire's starting to suck the oxygen out of the air, right? That's what fire does. And he's having a tough time breathing. And the smoke, I'm sure, is not making things easy. It's got to be a hellish scene. The only consideration that could have induced me to keep on working then, when I found it almost impossible to move my limbs, was the fear, right? And fear is a powerful tool, growing more strongly each moment into a certainty that some catastrophe was approaching. The crimson reflection in the western portion of the sky was rapidly increasing in size and intensity. Then between each stroke of my pickaxe, I heard plainly, in the midst of the unnatural calm and silence reigning around, the strange and terrible noise already described, the muttered thunder of which became more distant, or more distinct, as it drew each moment nearer. This sound resembled the confused noise of a number of cars and locomotives approaching a railroad station, or a rumbling of thunder, with the difference that it never ceased, but deepened in intensity each moment more and more. The spectacle of this menacing crimson in the sky, the sound of this strange and unknown voice of nature constantly augmenting in terrible majesty, seemed to endow me with supernatural strength. So he's hearing this, got to be god-awful rumble in the distance. It's just death coming. And he says it just gave him supernatural strength to just keep digging, keep digging. Okay, so then he goes, Mrs. Tyler, the hostess, approached me. Oh no, about 9, the company dispersed, and Mrs. Tyler, the hostess, approached me. The actions of the priest always make a certain impression, even on Protestants. Father, she questioned, do you think there's any danger? I don't know, was my reply, but I have an unpleasant presentiment and feel myself impelled to prepare for trouble. But if a fire breaks out, Father, what are we to do? In that case, madam, seek the river at once. I gave her no reason for advising such a course. Perhaps I really had none to offer, beyond that it was my innate conviction. Shortly after, Mrs. Tyler and her family started in the direction of the river and were saved. I learned later that out of the 8 guests assembled at her house that evening, all perished with the exception of 2. Ugh. So you're just seeing death. It's just an awful, awful scene. So he goes, when hastening through the street on my way to the river, at the moment of the storm burst forth, the wind impelled me in the direction of this house. A death-like silence now reigned within it, as if it had been restored to the inmates, or fear had suddenly penetrated to their hearts. Without shout or word, they re-entered the place, closing the doors as if to bar death out. A few minutes later, the house was swept away. What became of them, I know not. Right? It just got engulfed in flames. I don't know if he meant it literally was swept away, because we heard about that as well, where houses were just picked up in these firestorms and gone. It says the wind, forerunner of the tempest, was increasing in violence, the redness of the sky deepening, and the roaring sound like thunder seemed almost upon us. He said, it was now time to think of the Blessed Sacrament, object of all objects, precious, priceless, especially in the eyes of a priest. It had never been a moment absent from my thoughts, for of course I had intended from the first to bring it with me. Hastening then to the chamber containing the tabernacle, I proceeded to open the ladder, but the key, owing to my haste, slipped from my fingers and fell. There was no time for further delay, so I caught up the tabernacle with its contents and carried it out, placing it in my wagon, as I knew it would be much easier to draw it thus than bear it away in my arms. My thought was I should meet someone who would help me in the task. I re-entered seek the chalice, which had not been placed in the tabernacle, when a strange and startling phenomenon met my view. It was a cloud of sparks that blazed up here and there with sharp detonating sound, like a powder exploding, and flew from room to room. I understand then that the air was saturated with some special gas, and I could not help to think that if this gas lighted up from a mere contact with a breath of hot wind, what would it be when fire would come in actual contact with it? The circumstance, though menacing enough, inspired me with no fear. My safety seemed already assured. Outside the door, in a cage attached to the wall, was a jay that I had in my possession for a long time, and not a joint. This instinct of the birds in foreseeing a storm is well known, and my poor jay was fluttering wildly round his cage, beating against its bars as if seeking to escape, and uttering shrill notes of alarm. I grieved for its fate, but could do nothing for it. The lamps were burning on the table, and I thought, as I turned away, how soon their gleam would be eclipsed in the vivid light of a terrible conflagration. So he says there's some special gas. What do we have? He says sparks, cloud of sparks, and blazed up here and there with a sharp detonating sound, like that of powder exploding, and flew from room to room. I understood then that the air was saturated with some special gas. I could not help thinking, if the gas lighted up from mere contact with breath of a hot wind, what would it be when it came in contact with fire? That's one of those passages where I've been stewing on that one, and we'll get into some ideas as to what alternate theories as to what caused the fire. And when you hear things like that, these extra gas and powder and explosions, it makes you think of weapons, that this was a targeted attack in combination with nature. I vainly called my dog, who, disobeying the summons, concealed himself under my bed, only to meet death there later. Then I hastened out to open the gate as to bring forth my wagon. Barely had I laid hand on it when the wind, heretofore violently, rose suddenly to a hurricane, and quick as lightning opened the way for my egress from the yard by sweeping planks, gate, and fence away into the space. The road is open, I thought. We have only to start. I had delayed my departure too long. It would be impossible to describe the trouble I had to keep my feet, to breathe, to retain hold of buggy while the wind strove to tear from my grasp, or to keep the tabernacle in its place, to reach the river, even encumbered by any charge, was more than many succeeded in doing. Several failed, perishing in the attempt. How I arrived at it, even to this day, a mystery to myself. So when we start hearing that fire talk, one of the things that I saw was a firestorm. And so you look, and the firestorm is a conflagration which attains such intensity that it creates and sustains its own wind system. It's most commonly a natural, right? But we see it here in Peshtigo. And it says here, firestorms have also occurred in cities, usually due to targeted explosives, such as aerial fire bombings of Hamburg, Dresden, and Tokyo, and the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. So, can we rule targeted explosives out after learning that? Although it is quite possible it's a natural phenomenon, which it is. Could it have been aided by aerial fire bombings? I just find it real interesting. And we showed you what the firestorm looked like. So let's get back to here. He goes, the air was no longer fit to breathe, full as it was of sand, dust, ashes, cinders, sparks, smoke, and fire. It was almost impossible to keep one's eyes unclosed and to distinguish the road or recognize people, though the way was crowded with pedestrians as well as vehicles crossing and crashing against each other in general flight. Some were hastening towards the river, others from it. Whilst all were struggling alike in the grasp of a hurricane, 1,000 discordant, deafening noises rose on air together. So I can't imagine the sounds you're hearing, the screams, the roar of the fire, the cattle, the horses. Oh, just horror. Some were hastening towards the river, others from it, whilst all were struggling alike in the grasp of the hurricane. 1,000 discordant, deafening noises rose together. The neighing of horses, falling of chimneys, crashing of uprooted trees, roaring and whistling of the wind, crackling of fire as it ran with lightning-like rapidity from house to house. All sounds were there save that of human voice. People seemed stricken by dumb terror. They jostled each other without exchanging look, word, or counsel. The silence of the tomb reigned among the living. Nature alone lifted up its voice and spoke. Though the meeting crowded vehicles to taking a direction quite opposite to that which I myself was following, it never entered my mind that it would perhaps be better for me to follow them. Probably it was the same thing with them. We all hurried blindly on to our own fate. Almost with first steps taken in the street, the wind overturned and dragged me with the wagon close to the tavern already mentioned. Farther on, I was again thrown down over some motionless object lying on the earth. It proved to be a woman and a little girl, both dead. I raised a head that fell back heavily as lead. With a long breath, I rose to my feet, but only to be hurled down again. Farther on, I went down. Farther on, I met my horse, whom I had set free in the street. Whether he recognized me, whether he was in that spot by chance, I cannot say. But whilst struggling anew to my feet, I felt his head leaning on my shoulder. He was trembling in every limb. I called him by name and mentioned him to follow me, but he did not move. He was found partly consumed by fire in the same place. Just awful, awful conditions. All right. So while the wind blew, no. Okay, so when hardening through the street on my way to the river at the moment the storm burst forth, the wind impelled me in a direction of this house, a death-like silence. Now, oh no, we already did this one. Going the wrong way. Sorry, guys. The wind blew the flames and cinders directly into the water. Now think about that. The people are in the water, and now it's blowing the flames into the water. It's like there's nowhere to go. Remember, there's very few bridges, and whatever bridges that are on are packed or are being burned also. So he says, this place was no longer safe. I resolved then to cross to the other side through the bridge though the bridge was already on fire. The latter presented a scene of indescribable and awful confusion, each one thinking he could attain safety on the other side of the river. Those who lived in the east were hurrying towards the west, and those who dwelt in the west were wildly pushing on to the east, so that the bridge was thoroughly encumbered with cattle, vehicles, women, children, and men, all pushing and crushing against each other so as to find an issue from it. Arrived amid the crowd on the other side, I resolved to descend the river to a certain distance below the dam, where I knew the shore was lower than the water shallower. But I found this impossible. The sawmill was on the same side, at the angle of the bridge, as well as the large store belonging to the company standing opposite across the road were both on fire. So he's seeing now everything's on fire. The banks of the river, as far as the eye could reach, were covered with people standing there, motionless as statues, some with eyes staring, right? They're probably in shock, just pure shock, just frozen, like what the fuck is going on? Upturned towards heaven, and tongues protruded. There you go. The greater number seemed to have no idea of taking any steps to procure their safety, imagining, as many afterwards acknowledged to me, that the end of the world had arrived and that there was nothing for them but silent submission to their fate. Wow. Think about that. You're just there and they've just come to peace with it. They're like, I'm going to die. I'm going to die on this little tiny sandy beach next to this river or in this river. At the same moment, I heard a splash of the water along the river's bank. All followed my example. It was time. The air was no longer fit for inhalation, whilst the intensity of the heat was increasing. A few minutes more, and no living thing could have resisted its fiery breath. He said it was about 10 o'clock when he entered the river. He said, once in water up to our necks, I thought we would at least be safe from fire, but it was not so. The flames darted over the river as they did over land. The air was full of them, or rather the air itself was on fire. Guys, this isn't just like a passing through. This is everything is consumed. An all-consuming fireball that is just moving. And now you add in these high wind conditions, and this thing is just dancing all over the landscape. And this just sounds like an absolute horror. The terrible whirlwind that had burst over us at the moment I was leaving home had, with continually resolving circle of opposing winds, cleared the atmosphere. The river was as brighter than by day, and the spectacle presented by these heads rising above the level of the water, some covered, some uncovered, the countless hands employed in beating the waves, was singular and painful. in the extreme. So free was I from fear and anxiety that might naturally have been experienced to reign in my mind at such a moment, that I actually perceived the ludicrous side of the scene at times and smiled within myself at it. When turning my gaze from the river, I chanced to look either to the right or left, before me or upwards. I saw nothing but flames. Houses, trees, and the air itself were on fire. Above my head, as far as the eye could reach into space, alas, too brilliantly lighted, I saw nothing but immense volumes of flames covering the firmament, rolling over the other, rolling one over the other with stormy violence, as we see masses of clouds driven wildly hither and thither by the fierce power of the tempest. This is just a powerful storm. And you can look right here in this, at this drawing, you just see these people. It's just panic. They're just grabbing anything they can. They're mixed in. You got cattle running over here on the left side. You've got birds. You've got a burning house. You've got people in boats. You've got people on the shore. It's just gotta be chaos. Okay, so enveloped in a roll of disordered linen, evidently caught up in the haste. Oh, horror! On opening these wraps to look on the face of her child, it was not there. It must have slipped from her grasp in her hurried flight. Oh, no. No, I wanted to read that. Shit. Never mind. But anyway, this woman was so flustered, she forgot her child. She grabbed the empty blanket and ran with that and did not grab her child. And then she did find out, luckily, that her child was found and saved by others. Okay, so that's a bonus. Dreading that so long a sojourn in the water might be followed by severe cramps, perhaps death, I endeavored to ascend the bank a short distance so as to ascertain the temperature, but my shoulders were scarcely out of the river when the voice called to me, "Father, beware, you are on fire." Father, do you not think that this is the end of the world? I do not think so, was my reply. But if other countries are burned as ours seem to have been, the end of the world, at least for us, must be at hand. So this is the kind of chaos and death and destruction they're thinking about is end of the world. They're thinking this is Armageddon. This is it. This is the apocalypse. This is game over. This is what everybody keeps talking about, right? The end times. Everybody and any time of disaster always seems to lean towards it being the end times. How many times has it been the end times? How many times have we reset? That's a question I've been on the hunt for a while, and I'll keep hunting for it because we know there's been multiple resets throughout time. Here I was seized with a violent chill. A young man, perceiving it, threw a blanket over me, which at once afforded me relief. And soon after, I was able to leave this compulsory bath in which I had plunged for about 5.5 hours. Wow. So he's sitting in this river for 5.5 hours in October in Wisconsin. Think about that, guys. That water's freezing. At best, it's in the 40s. Maybe, yeah, 40s, I would say. Though close to a large fire arising from heaps of burning fragments, I was still convulsively shivering, feeling at the same time a complete prostration of my body and spirit. My chest was oppressed to suffocation, my throat swollen, and in addition to almost total inability to move, I would scarcely use my voice, utter even a word. Almost lifeless, I stretched myself out full length on the sand. The sand was still hot, and the warmth in some degree restored me. Removing shoes and socks, I placed my feet in immediate contact with the heated ground and felt additionally relieved. I was lying. I mean, people pay good money for that shit. I mean, that's a hot, steamy sand. Again, though, think of the temperatures. Think of how hot it must be for the sand to be that warm that it gives him relief when he's got the chills. I was lying beside the ruins of a large factory, the beams of which were still burning. Around me were piles of iron hoops belonging to the tubs and buckets lately destroyed. With the intention of employing these latter to dry my socks and shoes, now the only possessions left to me, I touched them, but found that they were still intolerably hot. That's crazy. Yeah, you'll see here, and this is a little painting, the plight of the victims trapped in such outlying areas as the sugar bushes. So these people are hiding out in the woods. Yet, strange to say, numbers of men were lying, some face downward, across these iron circles. Whether they were dead or rendered almost insensible from the effects of the damp and cold, were seeking the warmth that the sand afforded me, I cannot say. I was suffering too intensely myself to attend to them. My eyes were now beginning to cause me the most acute pain, and this proved to be the case, to a greater or less extent, with all those who had not covered theirs during the storm of fire through which we had passed. Right? So they probably burned their eyeballs. Putting on dry clothes afforded immediate relief to the pain and oppression of my chest, enabling me to breathe with more ease. Finally, day dawned on the scene with whose horror and ruin none were yet fully acquainted. So now, sun's starting to come up. The devastation and the reality of it is going to be revealed. Behold us then, all assembled in this valley like survivors after a battle. And you see this over and over again. There's a lot of alliterations to war in this the great fires, a lot of personification of fire, giving it human qualities. It's very interesting the way they describe things, to say the least. Some safe and well, and others were more or less wounded. Some were very much so, especially a poor old woman, fearing to enter the river completely, had lain crouched on the bank, partly in the water, partly out, and consequently exposed to the flames. She was now stretched out on the grass, fearfully burned, and suffering intense agony, to judge from her heart-rending moans and cries. As she was dying and had asked for me, I was brought to her, and though I feared, I proved but a poor consoler. I could not unclose my inflamed eyes, could scarcely speak, and felt so exhausted and depressed myself that it was difficult to impart courage on others. The poor sufferer died shortly after. Those among us who had sufficient strength for the task dispersed in different directions to seek information concerning the friends whom they had not yet seen, and returned with appalling tidings relating to the general ruin and the number of deaths by fire. One of those told me that he had crossed to the other side of the river and found all the houses as well as the church in ashes, while numbers of corpses were lying by the wayside, so much disfigured by fire as to beyond recognition. Ugh. So we go at the length. The people of Marinette were informed of our condition, and about 1 o'clock, several vehicles laden with bread, coffee, and tea arrived. These vehicles were commissioned at the same time to bring back as many of our number as they could contain. Anxious to obtain news from Marinette, I inquired of one of the men sent to our assistance if Marinette had also suffered from the fiery scourge. Thank God, Father, no one perished, though all were dreadfully alarmed. We have had many houses, however, burned. All mills and houses from our church down to the bay have gone. And the church, it is burned. The handsome presbytery, burned. The new schoolhouse burned also. Ah, and I had presumed that the poor unfortunates of Peshtigo to bring them to Marinette and shelter them in these very buildings. Thus, I found myself bereft in the same hour of my 2 churches, 2 presbyteries, and schoolhouse, as well as all private property belonging to them or to myself. So this is a few men were to be seen going backwards and forwards, looking after their property or asking details concerning the conflagration at Peshtigo from those who had just arrived from that ill-fated spot. No women were to be seen in the streets, nor even in the houses, the latter having been abandoned. The children, too, with their joyous outcries and noisy mirth, had disappeared from the scene. These shores, a short while since animated, now resembled a desert, and it was a movement of overwhelming and uncontrollable terror that had created, as it were, this solitude, a terror which dated from the preceding night when the tempest of fire came surging on from Peshtigo, consuming all that part of Marinette and all that lay in its path. These boats afforded anything but a safe place of refuge. For if the conflagration had broken out as suddenly and raged as fiercely as it had done at Peshtigo, nothing could have preserved them from the flames. And the only alternative left to those on board would have been death by fire or water. So people are trying to get out any which way they can. Do you blame them? I do not one bit. I'm out of there. I'm not sticking around. I don't mess with fire. No way. Especially when this hot and you're seeing this devastation and hearing it all in these other towns. Get out. He said, the clothes I wore had been greatly injured by my long sojourn in the water, and I would have willingly replaced them, but found this impossible. Okay. It was on the 11th of October, Wednesday afternoon, that I revisited for the first time the site of what had once been the town of Peshtigo. Of the houses, trees, fences that I looked on 3 days ago, nothing whatever remained, save a few blackened posts still standing, as if to attest to the impetuous fury of the fiery element that had destroyed all before it. Wherever the foot chanced to fall, it rested on ashes. So it's just everything's burned. It's a scene out of a war. The iron tracks of the railroad had been twisted and curved in all sorts of shapes. Think about that. The iron tracks of the railroad had been twisted and curved into all sorts of shapes. Now, if that's just done by fire and wind, that is some powerful stuff. Now, you mix in a few earthquakes, it makes it a little more plausible and understandable. But if we're just basing that iron railroad tracks were twisted and curved by this fire, we're dealing with something that is much bigger than a firestorm. All around these trunks, I perceived a number of holes running downwards deep into the earth. They were the sockets where the roots had lately been. I plunged my cane into one of them, thinking what must have been violent of that fire had been, which ravaged not only the surface of the earth, but penetrated so deeply into its bosom. Then I turned my wondering gaze into the direction where the town had lately stood, but nothing remained to point out its site except the boilers of the 2 locomotives, the iron of the wagon wheels, and brick and stonework of the factory. Now, remember, we talked about this before, about how hot it must be to burn through a tree. Anyone that's tried to burn stumps before knows how hot and how direct that fire must be to efficiently burn a stump and the duration that it takes. These things, it's gone. He's just sticking his cane in the middle of it, and there's nothing but ashes. He says, all the rest was a desert, of that desolation of which was sufficient to draw tears from the eyes of the spectator. A desert recalling a field of battle after a sanguinary conflict. I don't know what that means. Charred carcasses of horses, crows, oxen, and other animals laid scattered here and there. Think about the disease with that, guys. Ugh. The bodies of the human victims, men, women, and children, had been already collected and decently interred, their number being easily ascertained by counting the rows of freshly made graves. To find the streets was a difficult task, and it was not without considerable trouble that I succeeded at length in ascertaining the site where my house had lately stood. So he's just going back to rubble, ashes, nothing. Okay. My linen appeared at first glance to be in a state of perfect preservation, having kept its own whiteness with the exception of the pleats, which were somewhat discolored, but on touching it, it fell to pieces as if the substance had been consumed by some slow, peculiar process or traversed by electricity. Wow. So his linens crumbled. Amazing. While touching on this subject, we may add that many felt the shock of an earthquake at the moment that everything on the surface of the earth was trembling before the violence of the hurricane. So there you go. Right? I mentioned before, those railroad tracks probably aren't twisting and turning solely on wind. I mean, you get a hurricane like they're talking about, or a tornado, firestorm, like a directed energy. Yeah, maybe. But regular winds, just they're not going to do that kind of damage. So while touching on here again was a total loss. A few calcined bricks, melted crystal with crosses and crucifix more or less destroyed, alone pointed out to where my house had once been, while the charred remains of my poor dog indicated the site of my bedroom. Oh, God. That's just terrible. Going back to your house and finding the remains of your charred canine friends. That would just break my heart. Man. There, the carcasses of animals were more numerous than elsewhere, especially in the neighborhood of the bridge, where I saw remains of my poor horse in the spot where I had last met him, but so disfigured by the fiery death through which he had passed that I had some difficulty in recognizing him. Those who have a horse and appreciate the valuable services he renders them will not feel surprised at my speaking twice of mine. There exists between the horse and its master a species of friendship akin that unites two friends, and which in the man frequently survives the death of his four-footed companion. And I would say that same thing about dogs. I'm using that for the dog. I'm not a horse guy by any means, but with dogs, that's exactly how I feel about dogs. They are our companions if raised right. If not, you'll have an asshole on your hands, and good luck with that. One was a bereaved father seeking his missing children, of whom he had as to yet learned nothing. If, at least, he said, I could find their bones, but the wind has swept away whatever the fire spared. Children were seeking for their parents, brothers for brothers, husbands for their wives, but I saw no women among the scene of horror, which it would have been almost impossible for them to contemplate. They pointed out to me places where they had found such and such individuals. There, a mother lay prone on her face, pressing into her bosom a child she had vainly striven to save in devouring element. Here, a whole family, father, mother, and children lying together, blackened and mutilated by the fire fiend. Again, the fiend, the personification of this fire, turning it into a person, giving it qualities. Among the ruins of the boarding house belonging to the company, more than 70 bodies were found, disfigured to such a fearful extent that it was impossible to tell their age or sex. Farther on, 20 more had been drawn from a well. One of the workmen engaged in the construction of the church was found, knife in hand, with his throat cut, 2 of his children lying beside him in similar condition, while his wife laying a little further off, having evidently been burned to death. The name of this man was Tousley, and during the whole summer, he had worked at the church of Peshtigo. Doubtless, seeing his wife fall near him, and being convinced of the utter impossibility of escaping a fiery death, his mind became troubled, and he put an end to his own existence and that of his children. There were several other similar cases of suicide arising from the same sad causes. Because I can't imagine how horrific it must be to have to take the life of your children with your own hands. I don't know if I'd be able to do it. I really don't. I don't know if there's an instance where I'd be able to take my son's life. I mean, that's just, it's biblical, obviously, but at the same time, I don't know if I'm there. In the midst of the universal consternation pervading all minds, a man found it degraded enough to insult not only the general sorrow and mourning, but also death itself. Enslaved by the wretched vice of avarice, he had just been taken in the act of despoiling the bodies of the dead, or whatever objects in the fire had spared. A jury was formed, his punishment put to vote, and he was unanimously condemned to be hanged on the spot. But where would the rope be found? The fire had spared nothing. Somebody proposed substituting the former with an iron chain, which he had been employed for drawing logs. Oof. Execution was difficult under circumstances, and whilst the preparations dragged on slowly on, the miserable man loudly implored mercy. The pity inspired by the mournful surroundings softened at length the heart of the judges, and after having made him crave pardon on his knees for the sacrilegious thefts of which he had been guilty, they allowed him to go free. It may have been that they were merely intended to frightening him. And you see this, though. There is a lot of cases of vigilante justice where people are caught looting, raping, murdering in some cases, and they are killed on the spot. They are hanged right then and there. I had not gone far before I saw much more than I would have desired to see. All in this line had perished, and perished in masses, for the vehicles were crowded with unfortunates who, flying from death, had met it all sooner, and in its horrible form. In those places where the flames had enfolded their bodies in the fiery clasps, nothing now was to be seen but calcined bones. Charred mortal remains and the iron circles of wheels. It was with some difficulty that the human relics could be distinguished from those of the horses. Oh, there also all was in ashes, nothing remaining save the church bell. The latter had been thrown down a distance of 50 feet. One half was now lying there intact, while the other part had melted and spread over the sand in the silvery leaves. The voice of the bell had been last sound heard in the midst of the hurricane. Its lugubrious note yet seems at times to strike on my ear, reminding me of the horrors of which it was a forerunner. Now, here's another thing. Church bell. Melted and spread over the sand. We're talking hot temperatures, guys. This isn't just normal wood fire to melt an iron bell. Across the river on the half-charred beams of the bridge, which had been joined together so as to offer a means of passage, though a very perilous one, to those who chose to trust it themselves. I had barely reached the other side when one of my parishioners hastened to me, joyfully exclaiming, "Father, do you know what has happened to your tabernacle?" "No. What is it?" Come quickly, thus then and see, O Father, it is a great miracle. Everything in the immediate vicinity of this spot had been blackened or charred by flames. Logs, trunks, boxes, nothing had escaped. Yet, strange to say, there rose the tabernacle, intact in its snowy whiteness, presenting a wonderful contrast to the grimy blackness of the surrounding objects. What are the chances of that? Because I found the consecrated host intact and in the monstrous, while the violent concussions of ciborium must have undergone had not caused it even to open. Water had not penetrated within, and the flames had respected the interior as well as the exterior, even to the silky tissue lining the sides. All was in a state of perfect preservation. Wow, that's crazy. Before removing the tabernacle, I was busily occupied for 3 days and 3 nights, now seeking for the dead. Then, in taking up the water of various objects, I had thrown my own armfuls, and at the moment of leaving my house, into the wagon, which had been overturned, with it into the river. The most precious of all these was the chalice, which I was fortunate enough to find together with the paten. My search was greatly facilitated by opening of the dam and letting out the waters, which were 15 or 20 feet in depth. This step was necessary for the finding of the corpses and of the persons who, either seized by cramps or drawn in by the current, had been drowned during the night of the hurricane. So he says, a physician come from Fond du Lac to attend to the sick and burned, brought a newspaper with him, and in it read of terrible ravages wrought by fire on the same night, and strange to say, about the same area, not only at Peshtigo, but in many other places, and above all at Chicago. This great conflagration at Chicago proclaimed to the world that the myriad voices of journal and telegraph created far and wide an immense outburst of compassion in favor of the unfortunate city, diverting entirely the general attention from far more appalling calamities of which we had been hapless victims. So this is what you see, right? Over and over again. That the people who really, really need the help aren't going to get it right away, because we got to get the people in the big city. We got to get the people that are going to get the most attention, that are going to, get that news going for us. And okay. So it's a whole forest of huge maples, deeply and strongly rooted in the soil, were torn up, twisted, and broken, as if they had been willow wands. A tree standing upright here or there was an exception to an almost general rule. There lay those children of the forest, heaped up over one another in imaginable positions, their branches reduced to cinders, and their trunks calcined and blackened. Many asserted that they had seen large wooden houses torn from the foundations and caught up like straws by two opposing currents of air, which would raise them till they came in contact with the stream of fire. They then burst into flames and exposed thus to the fury of two fierce elements, wind and fire, were torn into pieces and reduced to ashes almost simultaneously. And this is what we were talking about, the firestorm, right? You could see it. If there's wind coming from either side of these houses or all sides of these houses, and is able to get under it and pick it up, and then that fire consumes it, boom, it's just going to go straight up. Still, the swiftness with which the hurricane, seemingly composed of wind and fire together, advanced was in no degree proportion to its terrible force. By computing the length of time that elapsed between the rising of the tempest in the southwest and its subsiding in the northeast, it will be easily seen that the rate of motion did not exceed 2 leagues an hour. The hurricane moved in a circle, advancing slowly, as if to give time to prepare for its coming. Many circumstances tended to prove that the intensity of the heat produced by the fire was in some places extreme, nay, unheard of, so not even heard of before. I have already mentioned that the flames pursued roots of the trees in the very depths of the earth, consuming them to the last inch. I plunged my cane down into the cavities and convinced myself that nothing had stayed the course of combustion save the utter want of anything to feed on. Hogshead of nails were found entirely metal lying throughout the direct path of the flames. Immense numbers of fish of all sizes died. In the morning after the storm, the river was covered with them. It would be impossible to decide what was the cause of death. It may have been owing to the intensity of the heat, the want of the air necessary for respiration, the air being violently sucked up by the current trend of the upward that forces the flame, right? We talked about with the firestorm, or they have been killed by some poisonous gas. It's more than probable that for a moment the air was impregnated with an inflammable gas, more destructive to human life. I've already mentioned that the tiny globules of fire flying about my house at the moment I quitted it. Whilst on my own way to the river, I met now and then gusts of an air utterly unfit for respiration, and was obliged on these occasions to throw myself to the ground to regain my breath, unless already prostrated involuntarily by the violence of the wind. While standing in the river, I noticed, and as I have already related, on casting my eyes upward, the sea of flame, as if it were the immense waves of which it were in a state of violent commotion, rolling tumultuously, one over another, and all at a prodigious height in the sky, consequently far from combustible material. How can this phenomenon be explained without admitting the supposition of immense quantities of gas that were accumulated in the air? Strange to say that there were many corpses found, bearing about them no traces of scars or burns, and yet in their pockets of their habiliments, equally uninjured watches, scents, and other articles in metal were discovered completely melted. What could do that, guys? It's not going to burn the person, but it's going to melt the objects in their pockets. This is some wild shit. It's not normal. How was it also that many escaped with their lives here and there on the cleared land as well as in the woods? The problem is a difficult one to solve. The tempest did not rage in all parts with equal fury, but escaped from its power with a mere affair of chance. None could boast of having displayed more presence of mind than others. Generally speaking, those who have happened to be in the low-lying lands, especially those of close excavations or even freshly plowed earth with which they could cover themselves, as the Indians do, succeeded in saving their lives. Most frequently, the torrent of fire passed at a certain height from the earth, touching only the most elevated portions. Thus, one could meet it standing erect without paying the penalty of almost instantaneous death. When the hurricane burst upon us, many, surprised and terrified, ran out to see what was the matter. A number of these persons assert that they then witnessed a phenomenon which may be classed with the marvelous. They saw a large black object resembling a balloon, which object revolved in the air with great rapidity, advancing above the summits toward the trees, toward a house which it seemed to single out for destruction. Barely had it touched the latter when a balloon burst with a loud report, like that of a bombshell, and at the same moment rivulets of fire streamed out in all directions. With the rapidity of thought, the house thus was chosen was enveloped in flames within and without, so that the persons inside had no time for escape. So this black object sounds like a missile, or sounds like something dropping a missile. This is just, these are some crazy, crazy ass fires. All right, we are almost done here. Actually, we are done here, because unless this last chapter. Okay. It says the last piece, slowly, the devastated area began to recover. Schoolhouses and bridges were rebuilt. Roads were repaired. Despite the substantial losses, William G. Ogden ordered that this wooden-ware company be rebuilt. Others followed suit, and Peshtigo struggled back to life. In January 1873, the governor who succeeded Lucius Fairchild reported, in the month of July, I visited the burnt district on the peninsula, as well as the west side of Green Bay. I found the devastation produced by the fire fiend such as impossible for me to comprehend without the aid of an eye. I was pleased to find that the majority of the survivors had returned to their clearings. Many had raised fair crops and were hopeful of the future. Now that's cool. That's what we want to hear, right? We want to hear that these people rebounded, and some did, but many didn't. Like we talked about in Chicago, the prices to now rebuild your structures with the new fire codes to accommodate the insurance agencies required materials and capital that these people didn't have. So they were forced to sell at a loss, usually, to the rich. So we see this pattern of, destruction, then the rich end up benefiting over and over and over. So those are firsthand accounts. There's many more out there if you really want. There's some great books out there on Peshtigo, but I'm not going to go any further. We've beaten this horse pretty good now with firsthand accounts. I've given you 3 or 4 different sources, and we can see that this fire behaved in a very irregular manner, and some would say in a manner similar to an area that had been bombed, where a weapon had been used. So what are some of the alternate theories that are going on out there as to the cause of the fire? Because remember, in the Chicago fire, they don't know what the cause was. They have essentially, they stopped the investigation and didn't go any further with it. But here, now we're going to look into things like comets. Okay, and one of the things that we see, think about Tunguska, right? The devastation there, that it just, from a meteor comet. Well, around this area in 1852, 1859, and 1866, so every 6 to 7 years, this comet was visible. But it wasn't visible after 1866, which would have been in 1871 or then in 1872. However, in 1872, November of 1872, what we have is the Andromeda meteor shower, which is something that is just pretty amazing. Because when you start looking in the details, where is it? Right here. We're talking like 30,000 meteorites that came showering down. It's not going to have it here. Let's see. Yeah, it's just one of those where you start looking at, okay, here's the comet. Oh, where's that meteor? Oh, it's right here. Okay. So 1872, we're looking, this is what it looked like. There's multiple accounts. It was in China. It was seen all over the world. That, let's see, how many fell here? Okay, so in Italy, observer P.F. Denza and 3 others recorded about 33,400 meteors during a 6.5-hour interval. Another storm, though not as intense, ensued on the same date in 1885. Now, do I question that Mr. P.F. Denza and 3 others were able to count 33,400 meteors over 6 hours? Yeah, I'm calling bullshit there. They did not count these things. Okay, and of course they used the number 33,000. But if we didn't see this comet as it was supposed to be seen in the year 1871-72, what does that tell us about it? Well, what we start seeing is that this may have been a meteor shower that caused or contributed. I'm not going to say cause, because as we've seen before, there were many, many other factors that were already in play, right? We talked about the drought. We know there were huge winds. Now, meteors, they're going to have an energetic presence they bring with them also. So that's another thing you have to consider too. If there is meteor in the area, that could be that spark that's needed to ignite all this. That could be the explanation for some of these intense temperatures. So, Discovery Channel reported on its website in March a presentation by Robert Wood, a retired McDonnell Douglas physicist who theorizes fragments of a comet discovered in the early 1820s, possibly, or 1920s, caused the fire. Wood theorized that small pieces of frozen methane, acetylene, and other high combustible materials hit the Earth, sparking the flames. Okay, where is methane coming from? Where is this acetylene coming from? Why are they finding these materials? We're doing an investigation on where the meteorite came from. His investigation also took him back to the comet Biela that was discovered in 1821 and returned every 6 years and 9 months. It was last seen in 1866 and never showed up in 1872. And then it showed up in broken form through the Andromedids. If these are coming down like buckshot with real dry conditions, Rayleigh theorizes how flaming space rocks could have ignited flames in many places. He said he's been contacted by relatives of survivors of the Peshtigo fire who shared stories from their ancestors about seeing fire falling from the sky. Fire from the sky. Keep that one in your back pocket. Physicist Wood, in his report, cited eyewitness reports of spontaneous ignition and fire balloons, guys. There's fire balloons again. Okay, we already saw that in the other book that we were reading last week. We mentioned the fire balloons there. There was a passage on it. Rayleigh said the Canadian geologist found a huge impact crater 200 feet below Lake Huron in the Port Huron area in the early 1990s. He said he has a relative who participated in drilling for water pipeline to serve Detroit in the same area as the same depth. He said crews discovered meteorite-like rock as they bored a hole for the pipeline. They were bringing it out and piling it up. He said the rock was reformulated and either was volcanic or a meteorite. It's another piece of evidence that the Michigan area and parts of Canada, Illinois are ground zero for an active meteor strike zone. Michigan State University's David Batch, director of the Abrams Planetarium, said he had not heard that theory before and is skeptical that a comet or meteorite could have caused the fires. Okay, so why is he skeptical? When they run over to them, there is a frost to them, he said. There is no known evidence of a comet or a meteorite causing a fire in history. Batch said that comet particles are mostly ice and would not hit the ground, while the meteorite only glows hot in the very outer surface as it passes through the atmosphere. He said it's only heated to those temperatures for a very short time. It's like the outer millimeter that is heated up. The rest of it stays cold. Okay. So you're getting different views here. One says, yes, it could be a meteorite. Here's does the simultaneous outbreak of a number of very bad fires over a large area after a dry summer require any special explanation? Common sense says no. Hence the large number of responses going poo-poo to this retired engineer Who's reviving his 130-year-old crackpot theory? Okay. Frozen methane, which unfortunately for his theory will not start fires, but only create you know what. However, the characteristics of these fires are so abnormal that from the very day they occurred, they have been considered mysterious. Peshtigo was a town of mills and factories. Okay, the same conditions prevailed at all the sites of the 1871 fires. He says stone buildings were reduced to calcinated ash. One large house was observed to burst into flame and rise 85 feet in the air on its own updraft. Large numbers of victims who had no burns or injuries, they simply suffocated in the oxygenless air. The largest number of the survivors who escaped in the woods surrounding the town, a total number of 9 towns in 4 Wisconsin counties, were essentially exterminated at the same time. In one town of 260, the death rate was 100%. No one survived. So all the evidence and survivor testimony suggests it was a firestorm, a non-natural phenomenon which was employed as a weapon of war. Once discovered by accident, he says. The creation of this firestorm requires a concentrated stock of combustibles, like a city, a hot, dry, windless weather, and simultaneous application of many thousand ignition sources. As a weapon of war, it is actually more devastating than nuclear weaponry. Successful firestorm tactics in 1945 killed 80,000 people in Hamburg, 250,000 people in Dresden, and nearly 1 million people in Tokyo. A firestorm is a multi-sourced fire so rapidly ignited over a large area of combustibles that the temperature in the core region rises to thousands of degrees in minutes. The updrafts from this heat source achieve vertical velocities of hundreds of miles per hour. Okay, a firewall or flame front before the core is reached. Firestorms spread upwind, that is, in all directions outward from the core. The firewall is being the boundary of oxygenated air and deoxygenated air. So it's very possible, is what we're seeing. Now, I want to go back, and I wonder if he's still here. Our good friend, okay, and I never miss an opportunity to touch on our good friend, the good old Greek fire, because it's always a possibility. It was used in the Civil War. So Civil War finished in 1865. Why would they not use leftovers now in 1871? Not too far of a stretch, especially when you hear of fire balloons, fire from the sky. Okay, yes, there were rockets at this time, so that's another possibility you could throw out there, like the Congreve rockets. We've talked about that in other episodes. We've talked about this in other episodes with the Greek fire. So you can't rule it out. Now, I've heard some people say, well, they could have possibly dropped Greek fire from airships. Possibly, unlikely, but possibly. Some say that there could have used airships with giant mirrors, like to focus heat and get these fires to ignite. I don't know if that's a real fact-worthy assessment either. It's fun to talk about, it's fun to think about, but I don't see it as being a justifiable explanation. But you look at that firestorm, right? And they talk about it's the same thing that happened in Hiroshima. Same thing. So we've looked at the meteor showers, and then you start now. There's one other thing that's pretty interesting that in 1883, 12 years after the Chicago fire, Ignatius Donnelly published a book called Ragnarok, A Reign of Fire and Gravel. And it says, though the book dealt primarily with the evidence of cometary disasters in ancient times, Donnelly suggested that the Chicago fire provided a small glimpse of the terror experienced by our earlier ancestors. There's reason to believe that the present generation has passed through the gaseous prolongation of a comet's tail and that hundreds of human beings lost their lives. So, he's saying, and he's basing it on Biela again, and his whole premise of his book was based on that too. And there's multiple books that talk about comets and the possibility of comets and what they could render. Now, we've talked about the rockets before, right? Rockets have been around since the early 1800s. That's always a possibility. You cannot rule it out. Is it likely? No, it's very low on the likelihood scale. So there is one other thing that I found very interesting. And it says one clue, perhaps, is the mention of electrical phenomena. Much has been said of the intense heat of the fires which destroyed Peshtigo, Menicani, Williamsonville, etc. But all that has been said can give the stranger but a faint conception of reality. The heat has been compared to that engendered by a flame concentrated on an object by a blowpipe. But even that would not account for some of the phenomena. For instance, we have in our possession a copper cent taken from the pocket of a dead man in Peshtigo sugar bush, which will illustrate our point. The cent has been partially fused, but retains its round form, and the inscription upon it's legible. Others in the same pocket were partially melted, and yet the clothing and the body of the man were not even singed. We do not know what way to account for this unless, as asserted, the tornado and fire were accompanied by electrical phenomena. There had to be, right? That's why I'm still so puzzled by that. By the melting in the pocket. How is that possible? We're just looking at some Greek fire here, but yeah, you look at some of these fires, and all right, let's get out of here. We're gonna go close. Where is okay? The Peshtigo fires. So Sugar Bush, right, is over here. There was fire jumping over Green Bay. That's how crazy it was. So I believe an electrical phenomena would tend to lean towards the comet side, if you think about it, because there had to be so much energy brought in with that comet. The electrical storm and the amount of electricity in the air must have been unbelievable. And who knows? Could the comet have made its circle but just not been visible then? Or broken up into pieces, started breaking up into pieces on that night, and it didn't finish until a year later. I don't really know. I don't know what to think of these, but when I see these temperatures, right, they're too hot for natural occurrence. And there's no explanation. There is no explanation for these fires. There's no final, they're going to say, okay, now one of the excuses is, oh yeah, the railroad workers, right? They had these little bonfires, and when the wind came through and spread, that's what ignited it all. Or, we had these little fires going for a week, and then all of a sudden this huge wind came in. It's possible, let's go to Occam's razor, right? The most likely thing is more than likely what happened. And that is that there were fires there raging, and that it did get swept up and extended but what I'm still battling with this. What is causing this. Okay, there's no explanation for this cyclonic storm that happens on that day that takes up more than half, if not 3/4 of the United States is impacted by this storm. It's amazing. I mean, it's just massive. I don't know how else to look at that, but that's where my question lies. This storm is tied to it. I feel like the comet has a tie to it because it was a repeating pattern showing up and it never showed up again. But we got the Andromeda meteor shower in November of 1872. So who knows what actually caused these fires? And there's so many people that, will make out no claims that, they're still sticking to the whole cow theory, which is total bullshit. And anybody that's going to believe this cow started a fire, it's another one of these fairy tales. And it's part of a narrative to make you downplay the significance of it. When more than likely, not more than likely, but in my eyes, more than likely, something nefarious happened here. Either there were plants along the way to make this fire worse in some of these areas. In Chicago, you look at the area that was burnt and it's one district, it's like a direct impact. Let's see, we can find that right here. Let's go back. We'll go back here. Where's that map? Okay, so we go back to the map of Chicago and you see the district impacted. It's right here. Right in the heart, northern half, I mean, I don't know, guys. It's just, it seems, and this is a great business district if you think about it, right? Ripe for business right here on the water. Great place to have things coming in and going out from. So that's where I still am skeptical about these. I have a hard time believing that all of these fires in this area are a coincidence. Now, again, let me just, for scope, let's go back to this map right here, because this will show you the scope and the extent of the fires. I mean, we're talking northern Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, and there were some in Canada as well. But we're supposed to believe a cow started the Chicago fire. And there's no connection between any of these fires whatsoever. None, according to the narrative. They're all 3 separate fires. Very interesting. I hope you guys enjoyed this. This was a long one. This was one, though, that I really enjoyed diving into. I love Chicago. I think Chicago is a fascinating city. There's something magical about that land that goes back. That even Detroit's in that same boat. Milwaukee's in that same boat. There's something about these lands that they need to control it. They need to have power over it. So with that, we are going to wrap. Now, my patrons, anybody that wants to join the Patreon, we are going to have 2 patron-only Zoom calls this month because the last Friday falls the day after Thanksgiving. Some people may be out of pocket, and I want as many people as possible to be able to join. So we're going to do one Friday, November 25th, 9 p.m. Friday, December 2nd, 8:30 p.m. And what we will do is the regular, I will shoot out the Zoom link the day of. Anyone that wants to hop on, feel free to come and go. We will probably be on till about 11:30, I would say. 12 o'clock, probably the first one. I usually go about 3 hours on these. I'll leave it open. You can come and go as you please. It's great to talk with people. People bring some of their own stuff they've been looking into. We exchange books, we'll find PDFs and stuff out there too. It's a great little group of people that we have here. So anyone that's interested in joining, feel free. It's patreon.com/The Great Deception Podcast. You guys can donate in other ways too. We have a Venmo in the description. Merch. Guys, Christmas is coming up. You want to get some Great Deception Podcast merch? for your family, go for it. Wake them up. Have them question everything. That's in the merch store. Go check the link. The coffee mugs are pretty nice. Tumblers are actually decent. I was shocked at the quality of those as well. And the glasses are pretty cool. I drank out of one this weekend, and I didn't drink it. My brother-in-law had one this weekend. We were joking about, and they got the coffee mugs and stuff too. So it's kind of cool. So if you want to support the show, it's a great way to do it. It doesn't do much for me. I get nothing off of it, but just having the gear out there is more what I'm looking at. And then I love seeing people post it on Instagram or whatever. And I'll share it on my page too. I love seeing the gear out there, representing the colors, flying the flag of this little engine that could of a podcast. So guys, next up will be another wonderful discussion with Matthew Smith. We're going to be talking old world. We're going to be talking a lot of energies in the architecture, how we're going to discuss some free energy ideas that he's been looking into. And then after that, I want to get into cymatics a little bit and some of the, frequencies, things like that, and how it ties to architecture. And that's what Matthew and I will get into too. But this will build on that. I got a ton of pictures and some books and stuff we can talk about, look at some architecture and some cathedrals and how the layouts of cathedrals may impact frequency and things like that. So there's a lot of cool stuff out there. So stay tuned. And as always, guys, I greatly appreciate your support. I do ask, though, if you could leave a review. It's much appreciated, whether on Google or Apple. 5 stars preferably. You can say whatever you want in it. Just give us a good review so we can get in that algorithm, get more eyes to the show, more ears listening, and grow this little engine. I appreciate you all. Stay strong and question everything.